Naomi, finally turning over to the conversation. Thanks for listening. Before we start,
it's fun when I don't know German. I sort of only know little bits and pieces of German, so I sort of like pick out like one word in 6 or so, and then of course there's like H.P. Lovecraft and Hogwarts, and I'm like, yes,
I know these. Before we dive right into, your worlds, your books, as this is the Halloween special of Andere Welten, and as Halloween is around the corner, what did you dress up for as a kid?
Oh, as a kid, I'm like, oh, I could tell you what I dressed up like at New York Comic Con last week, but I don't know. I mean, as a kid, I feel like the only thing that's coming to mind is not actually a Halloween costume. When I was a kid here in the US, there was a line of like pajamas and underwear called Underoos that would be like superheroes. And I had a pair of Wonder Woman Underoos that I loved deeply. Yes.
Also,
Wonder Woman's pretty great.
An sich Naomi auf jeden Fall erinnern kann, ist eine, ja, wenn man es Verkleidung nennen möchte, es gibt eine Unterwäschenfirma, Underoos heißt sie, mit Superhelden-Unterwäsche. Und da hat sie sich Wonder Woman rausgesucht. Und das war, glaube ich, ein sehr besonderer Anblick. And talking about Comic-Con, what did you dress up for there?
It was what was it? Actually, what did I dress up as this year? I have this wonderful sort of steampunky outfit.
Nice.
It's like this giant poofy blue sort of shimmery satin skirt and like a buttoned up jacket that goes over it. Looks I think it's like 1830s era. And it was a handmade costume. I bought it at a convention from a cosplayer who was selling off her old costumes in order to buy material to make new costumes. And I was like, this will be mine. Yes. So it's that's a fun one. Last year, my husband, my daughter, and I all dressed up as Emerald City, like a little bit of from Wicked, the musical.
Yeah. Oh, wow, amazing. Ich fragte Naomi, als was sie sich bei der Comic-Con verkleidet hat, die jetzt kürzlich in den Staaten war, weil sie das erwähnte. Und sie hat gesagt, sie hat sich in ein wunderbares Steampunk-Kostüm gehüllt. Handgemacht, hat sie von einer Näherin abgekauft, die wahrscheinlich ihre alten Sachen loswerden wollte, um Platz für Neues zu schaffen. 1830, 1840, so hat sie es ungefähr datiert. Das Jahr davor war sie mit ihrer ganzen Familie unterwegs und hat sich quasi in der Emerald City aus dem Wicked Musical verkleidet. Das war, glaube ich, auch ein Anblick. But enough of Halloween. We can't talk about Halloween all the time. When you have these beautiful books we need to talk about. What I so admire about Scholomance is that it's very dark and very twisted and menacing. You, on the other hand, don't come across as any of those things. So is this a hidden side within you, or is it easy for you to get into this dark mindset?
It's interesting. I don't actually, I myself am a complete horror wimp. I cannot watch horror movies. Horror books typically scare me.
Mm-hmm.
The horror in the Scholomance really kind of evolved out of the sort of the world building, where it was really more about why would people, starting the legend of the Scholomance, right? Of the school where you attend at the risk of your soul.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the payment. One person pays with their soul for the other like 9 people. And that's such a terrible place. That's such a sort of dreadful place that I had to answer the question for myself as a writer, what makes people go here? And
good question.
The answer had to be, it's worse on the outside, right? Mm-hmm. It's worse. It has to be better to go than not.
Yeah.
And the monsters, the Maleficaria, sort of evolved out of that, really, out of that that fundamental need, and it was quite. I enjoyed the challenge of coming up with new ones that fit each scenario. But yeah, I guess I myself am a bit of an optimist. So
it's very good to hear, especially after reading your books. Ich fragte Naomi, deren Bücher ja wirklich sehr, sehr düster sind, sehr brutal, teilweise auch sehr, sehr bedrohlich, und sie mir aber gar nicht so erscheint. Also ob das irgendwie ein Flecken auf ihrer Seele ist oder wie es kommt, dass ihre Bücher eben so düster sind. Und sie hat eine sehr interessante Antwort gegeben, finde ich. Und zwar, dass diese Schule, die sie entworfen hat, diese Magierschule, das vorgegeben hat, dass das alles so düster wird. Denn diese Schule, die ja wirklich böse ist und gefährlich und tödlich und ein Schüler muss pro Jahr auch mit seiner Seele dafür bezahlen, dass alle anderen dort zur Schule gehen können. Warum sollte aber dann jemand überhaupt auf diese Schule gehen, wenn sie so schlimm ist? Und die einzige logische Antwort darauf ist, wenn die Außenwelt noch schlimmer ist. Und so fing das alles an. What I find interesting about Scholomance, aside from the atmosphere and the characters and the whole world building, which we have to dive into later on, is that ultimately, to me, it's a story about belonging, about fitting in, not fitting in, trying to fit in, maybe not wanting to fit in, or not trying to fit in, but still wanting to. And as I read your biography, I came across the fact that your grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe to the USA. And I was wondering, does this part of your family history has...
Sorry, my parents, actually.
Your parents, I'll see. Okay, wow. So even one generation earlier or later. So does this family history have anything to do with it?
I would say that my family history is a very strong influence on my two previous books, on Uprooted and Spinning Silver. Uprooted is very much my mother's story, and Spinning Silver is very much the story of my father's side of the family. In Scholomance, obviously there are layers to each book, and some of those layers are visible and some of them are not. And I would say the layer really that Scholomance is built on for me is more as a parent, and quite specifically engaging mentally with climate change and privilege around climate change. And that's kind of the moving engine that's sort of deep beneath the surface, that is not necessarily visible on top, as it were.
I see. Ich fragte Naomi, deren Eltern, ich hatte das falsch recherchiert, deren Eltern aus Osteuropa in die USA emigriert sind, ob die Themen des Buches Scholomance irgendwas damit zu tun haben. Denn ich zumindest habe es auch so gelesen, dass gerade Galadriel, der Hauptcharakter, Schwierigkeiten hat, sich einzufinden und ihren Platz zu finden. Und ich dachte, vielleicht könnte es etwas damit zu tun haben. Sie meinte aber eher ihre früheren Werke. Da hätte sie eher die Geschichte ihrer Mutter und ihres Vaters aufgearbeitet. Dieses Buch ist dann eher aus Perspektive eines Elternteils geschrieben und hat, obwohl sie sagt, dass Bücher immer ganz viele verschiedene Geschichten haben, dann doch eher was mit Klimawandel zu tun. Still, let's stick with the exciting family history you have. So I guess you grew up on Long Island. Your father is from Lithuania and your mother is from Poland. And how much of this heritage was still alive when you were growing up, in terms of food or maybe fairy tales or language? So how did you grow up, in which cultural environment?
So I grew up in two slightly different cultural environments. My father's family, who were Lithuanian Jews, almost all the ones who survived moved to the US and were living in Long Island. And so that was around me immediately. My mother had to, because of the Iron Curtain, right, my mother had to defect, literally, to stay in the US, and had to sever ties with her family and her homeland. And that's, in a way, uprooted, right? You can sort of see that's the sensation. And so in a way, she tried very hard to kind of bring some of her culture to us, because she herself was so severed from it. And so I grew up speaking Polish until I was about 5 years old. And we grew up with a lot of Polish traditions around certain holidays. And at the same time, my father's family were around us. And so we were sort of growing up with their traditions around us. That was more sort of like just surrounding. And the community that we lived in was very heavily Jewish. So many of my friends were Jewish. And so that was sort of like the ocean I was swimming in, and my mother was creating an island of Polish culture for me. And so those two things, and obviously New York itself, where I still live, is really a city of immigrants. It's so strongly characterized by immigrant culture, by people coming in, that it feels very natural. A lot of my friends are first generation Americans as well.
Ich werde das kurz zusammenfassen. Ich fragte Naomi nach den Traditionen bei sich zu Hause beim Aufwachsen, denn ihr Vater ist aus Litauen gekommen, ihre Mutter aus Polen, hinter dem Eisernen Vorhang damals noch. Sie musste also quasi komplett alles abbrechen und neu starten. Deswegen hat ihre Mutter auch versucht, sehr viele Traditionen aufrechtzuerhalten, eben weil sie diesen drastischen Bruch vollführen musste. Naomi ist auch aufgewachsen, hat Polnisch gesprochen, Polnisch gelernt auch. Zur gleichen Zeit war sie aber natürlich auch umgeben von den jüdischen Traditionen ihres Vaters. In ihrem Viertel, in dem sie aufgewachsen ist, wohnten sehr viele Juden. Aber sie sagt, on top von all dem ist natürlich New York eine Stadt erbaut von Einwanderern und durchdrungen von den ganzen Geschichten von Einwanderern. So ist es dieser klassische Melting Pot, der dazu kommt. What I find interesting, Naomi, about your vita is that you started out studying English literature. But then I guess you made a master in computer science. And these two fields, I mean, maybe they are not worlds apart, but they are not exactly close. So how did this happen? Has the interest for both fields been there all along, or how did this come about?
Always, yes. Well, not always. When I was a kid, my parents were both programmers, so it was completely it was boring and uncool completely. And then, I got to college and I actually ended up working on a text-based, just an amateur text-based computer game with friends, and had to learn programming to build the things that I wanted to build. And for me, that's the commonality in both writing and coding. It is making something. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'm making a novel, sometimes I'm making a computer game, sometimes I'm making a website. But either way, it's still a process of creation. It's a creative process. It's an imaginative process. And that's, so I'm less interested in sort of like the theoretical underpinnings of computer science. For me, I was studying it to go write computer games. And then instead I wrote novels. It sort of goes back and more creative control with novels.
All right, okay. Ich habe Naomi gefragt nach ihrem Werdegang. Sie hat mit englischer Literatur angefangen und danach noch quasi Computer Science draufgelegt. Diese Studiengänge sind zumindest aus meiner Sicht relativ weit auseinander, aber sie sagt, das stimmt gar nicht. Denn sowohl beim Schreiben als auch beim Programmieren, beim Coden, erschafft man etwas aus nichts. Und das hat ihr eigentlich immer daran gefallen. Aber vielleicht nicht immer, denn ihre Eltern waren beide auch Programmierer, sagt sie. Und das fand sie damals fürchterlich langweilig. Übrigens, die Fragerunde ist eröffnet. Die ersten Fragen kommen rein, sehe ich. Aber fragt einfach ab sofort, was immer ihr wissen wollt. Wenn ihr nicht wollt, dass ich die ganze Zeit meine eigenen Fragen stelle. Sonst tue ich natürlich das. So, English literature and computer science. I mean, today you work as a novelist mainly, but you wrote or you designed and developed one specific, very famous computer game, Neverwinter, from of the web Neverwinter Nights Cosmos, so to say. How do you design a computer game?
So in fact, that was the thing that I did just before I started writing novels. And the key interesting piece of it was before then I wrote fan fiction as a hobby, always short pieces. But to make a computer game, you have to sort of consider the structure of the game in a kind of more technical. You have to think about the story of it in a more technical way. You have to think about where are the sort of climactic beats going to land so that the artists who are working at the same time as you can start working on the cinematics. You have to think about, well, what environments are we going to create so the artists can be building those environments. And that was really, it was a very interesting process. And at the end of it, I feel like I came out with that sort of more structural approach to storytelling kind of built into my head. And it's what allowed me to move to writing novel-length work.
Beautiful. So the one inspired the other and the one helped the other in the process. Ich habe Naomi gefragt, wie man denn eigentlich ein Computerspiel designt. Sie hat eins für die Neverwinter Nights Saga mitentwickelt. Und sie sagt, ja, natürlich muss man sehr viel strukturierter vorgehen bei einem Computerspiel, weil man da ja auch nicht alleine dran arbeitet. Man muss ja natürlich den Menschen auch die Möglichkeit geben, mit dem, was man sich ausdenkt, dass die damit weiterarbeiten können. Aber wozu es bei ihr geführt hat, sagt sie, das finde ich hochinteressant, ist, dass sie einen deutlich strukturierteren Ansatz an ihr eigenes Storytelling da mitgenommen hat, was es ihr jetzt eben erlaubt, diese dann doch sehr, sehr ausufernden, langen, komplexen Bücher zu schreiben. So the questions from the audience are coming in bit by bit now. And one is rather an interesting question, I guess. It's focusing on Scholomance. As this is a school about monsters, or full of monsters, have you been inspired by your own school experience?
I think that all of us, right? One of the things that I was trying to do in Scholomance, one of the things that I think the magic boarding school trope in general lets you do as a storyteller is it lets you literalize the emotions of adolescence. So I think that I suspect that every one of us has had the moment of walking into a cafeteria and looking around at the tables and thinking, where am I going to sit? And when you're a child, when you're young, that feels like such an important decision. It feels like a very stressful thing. It feels like a life and death moment. And obviously in the Scholomance, the idea is that it literally is life and death. Those social skills that I think we're all, especially in middle school years, struggling to develop are so important. They're literally make the difference between whether you live and die. And that's obviously something that is happening in the book. And that's part of the broader approach of it, which is that adolescence, right? That story of coming of age, but that adolescence in our lives is the first time, I think, when we consciously have to grapple with the process of, am I going to become the person that I want to be? Am I going to survive this process of becoming the person that I want to be? And metaphorically survive in the sense of, am I going to achieve, my self identity, the things that I'm aiming for? Am I going to stay true to myself? Am I going to not stay true? Am I going to have to repair that later on in my life? Am I going to, find out that actually I'm becoming somebody that I didn't expect I was going to be, right? Am I going to have to change my own self-concept? Those questions are with us throughout our entire lives. But in adolescence, in that moment of coming of age, that first moment, it is the first time, and it is deeply fraught, and then has echoes that resound through the rest of our lives. And that's what I think makes it kind of a universal story. I think that's why, a lot of people read, for instance, young adult books that have that narrative, even when they're adults, right? And because I think it's a narrative that is in fact universal, because we're always still on that journey. And so I feel like for myself, I am accessing memories of my own school years, when I was the nerd who did not have anybody to sit with, but at the same time, I'm also accessing more recent memories as well, where it's still just, we are still trying to grow, right?
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah. Auf die Frage, ob sich Naomi bei dem Entwurf dieser Scholomance voller Monster von ihrer eigenen Schulzeit inspirieren ließ, Sie eine, wie ihr mitbekommen habt, sehr lange Antwort gegeben. Ich werde mich auf eine kurze Zusammenfassung beschränken. Sie sagt, im Grunde ist Scholomance ein Symbol, eine Metapher für das Heranwachsen. Denn das erste Mal in unserem Leben müssen wir in diesem Alter, in der Adoleszenz, wirklich wichtige, prägende Entscheidungen treffen. Dieses Coming of Age, was dann darüber bestimmt, wer wir werden oder wer wir sein wollen. Das sind in diesen jungen Jahren meistens Fragen, die über Leben und Tod entscheiden. Nicht wirklich, aber es fühlt sich für uns in diesem jungen Alter eben so an. Und an dieser Schule ist es aber eben wirklich so. Diese Fragen entscheiden über Leben und Tod. Und es geht auch da wieder um ihre eigenen Erfahrungen in ihrer eigenen Kindheit, wo sie eben der Nerd war und sich vielleicht nicht wirklich zugehörig gefühlt hat. Aber es geht auch um jüngere Erfahrungen, weil wir alle immer noch auf diesem Weg sind. Wir haben uns vielleicht ein bisschen eher gefunden, als wir uns mit 16, 17 gefunden hatten, aber der Prozess, der ist andauernd. Und dafür ist Scholomance eigentlich ein wunderbares Symbol. And as we are talking about Scholomance right now, I need to know more about the place, because to me it's one of the most fascinating world building processes I've been witnessing in recent years or forever in fantasy. There's nothing like it in literature, I guess, And I thought to myself, designing such a building, I mean, it is in something like a void, okay? So you can go a bit easy there on some of the physics maybe, but still, architecture, art history, geography, physics still. How did you create such a school, and where did you start, and how long did it take you?
So for me, whenever I write, I'm a discovery writer. So the actual physical shape of the Scholomons, initially, for quite a long time, the void was there from the beginning. I knew about the void. But for a long time, the rooms were sort of like these stone medieval cells. It was sort of monastic. It was like that sort of medieval castle feel that I think many times we gravitate towards by default when we're thinking about a school of magic, right?
Right.
And I knew that it wasn't quite right, but at the same time, I generally try, as a writer, I try not to nail something down until I need to, because the later that something, at the point where something really needs to be nailed down is usually when I have all the information that I need from the story that I've written so far to tell me how I should nail it down. And in this case, I think I was about maybe a third of the way through book one. And I had to, one of my beta readers was reading it and asked me a question about, so where exactly, how are they getting from this room to that room? I don't remember the specific question, but I remember it was a question about sort of like, how are they moving through the school in this way? And how are they getting to graduation? And I had to, at that point, stop and really think about the architecture coherently. And I realized by that point, I'd already kind of gotten this sense that there was this sort of process, a kind of engine of exploitation, right, happening, that this process of extracting work out of people, extracting labor, that felt, obviously, that synced up with the Industrial Revolution in my head. And I had a very clear visual of some images that I'd seen many years ago, I think from the construction of the Titanic. The scale thing where there was a propeller that was this big. There's like old black and white photos, a propeller this big and a person standing next to it this big, right? And the sense of this thing that grinds people up, right? And so that element came in, that sense of scale of the kind of materials, that we're talking about steel, we're talking about iron, we're not talking about stone. And then again, I had the principle by then that the school was worse, that the school was better than what's on the outside. And that's because of the monsters, that there are fewer monsters inside. All right, so if that's how you're designing this building, if that's your goal as the person building the Scholomons, then obviously the rational thing to do is you create a bottleneck. You make the connection between the school and the world as tiny as possible. Just the bare minimum space. And that's where I suddenly got the sense, all right, so the bottom layer where the graduation layer is down at the bottom, and the students are up here and they're separated by this shaft. And then the question is, all right, so how do the seniors get down to the graduation hall? And that's where the image of the floors, the dorm rooms rotating down came to me. And that created the screw kind of design, the nuts and screws for the dorm rooms. And at that point, the question was, all right, so what's the size? And that I knew I needed about 1,600 students in each grade. And that came, so this is how this process works for me, right? Each piece comes with a thing.
Yeah.
I needed 1,600 students because I wanted some number of students from like all over the world, because I decided to make the Scholomons the only school of magic in the world. So I had to have the class size large enough that there would plausibly be multiple kids from New York, multiple kids from London, right? In this space. And then I basically went and looked online and found what's the smallest dorm rooms that I could find at universities. And I found that 7 feet wide was the minimum limit. And then I literally just did the math, 7 feet wide, 1,600 kids, and I got the diameter of the building and realized, wow, this is huge. But it was right, that synced up with my sense of the scale from those images of the Titanic.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
Right. Ich fragte Naomi nach der Scholomans, wie sie sich dieses unfassbare Gebäude überhaupt ausgedacht hat, geplant hat. Ne? Weil man braucht ja schon ein bisschen Architektur, ein bisschen Kunstgeschichte vielleicht. Man muss sich an ein paar physikalische Gesetze halten. Und sie hat gesagt, dass sie sich selbst als Discovery Writer bezeichnet, also eine schreibende Entdeckerin, die erst im Verlauf des Prozesses dann tatsächlich die Dinge auch konkret macht und bewusst offen lässt. Erst wenn sie die Story weit genug hat, dass sie weiß, dass sie quasi alle Fakten hat, macht sie quasi einen Deckel drauf und dann ist diese World quasi abgeschlossen, dann ist sie gebildet. Ihre Proofreader haben sie dann teilweise darauf aufmerksam gemacht oder gefragt, wie kommt man denn jetzt eigentlich aber von dem Zimmer zu der Graduation, wo man quasi die Abschlussprüfung schreibt. Dann hat sie gemerkt, okay, da muss man nochmal dran feilen und überhaupt hat sie sich dieses Gebäude von Anfang an sehr in einem Stil der industriellen Revolution vorgestellt. Vor allem sieht sie da alte Schwarz-Weiß-Fotos vom Bau der Titanic, diese gewaltigen Schiffsschrauben, gegen die ein Mensch eben verschwindend klein aussieht. Und diese industrielle Revolution, der Mensch gerät unter die Räder der Maschinen sozusagen ein bisschen auch aufgreift. Und sie hat sehr viel mit Recherche eben auch zugebracht, weil sie wusste genau, dass in jeder Klasse sind 1600 Schüler, denn Scholomans ist die einzige Magieschule weltweit. Also musste sie gucken, wie groß müssen dann mindestens die Schlafsäle sein, die Zimmer der Schüler dort. Und dann kam eben dieses riesige, gewaltige Gebäude zustande. And speaking of research, you're very meticulous in this area. Naomi, I once read, or I quote, once I spent a week researching whether there were sidewalks in Edinburgh in 1806. Okay, how come? Why is this part so important to you?
So in fact, research to me is actually not especially important, except if it is important. So that's right. So for instance, in the Temeraire series, which is about dragons in the Napoleonic Wars, what I really wanted was the sense of the dragons as being real, right? I wanted them to feel like real animals, not magical creatures. I wanted them to feel like real sort of living creatures sharing our world. And the conceit of it, obviously, is that we're just in the Napoleonic Wars. You have to accept the dragons were always there, and we're still in the Napoleonic Wars. And the way that I made the dragons feel real, that I allow you to have that experience, is by trying to make all the other details around them as accurate as possible, so that the world around them feels as consistent as possible, as coherent as possible. But for instance, Uprooted and Spinning Silver, those are both set not in, for instance, Uprooted is set in sort of a fantasy version of Poland, but it's not set in Poland. It's not set in any time period of Poland. It is set in the version of Poland that existed in my imagination when I was 5 years old. That was built on the fairy tales that my mother was telling me, that was built on the handful of books that she was able to share with me. And in that case, I actively avoided doing research because I didn't want anything to mess with my own sort of like half-remembered images. I was really kind of excavating internally. And with Scholomance is sort of in between, where it's set obviously in the modern day, and I tried to make the parts of the real world and the ways that it connects to the real world feel accurate. And historically accurate. Obviously, Scholomance engages with geopolitical realities, right? And so I was trying to represent those honestly as best I could. And things like the material, the question, how wide is a dorm room? Those kinds of details, thinking about, all right, there are 1,600 kids, about how many of them should be from various different countries, just, what are the languages that should be being spoken here? And insofar as it is not accurately representative, why? You have to explain that. And obviously part of that is because of historical inequities, right? And so that had to matter. And then the question is, all right, so why does that matter in the magical world? And the answer there was that enclaves are vulnerable, enclaves, if you're in a country that's being destroyed and torn apart by war, by imperialism, by anything, your enclave is very likely to be destroyed too, even if you're a wizard. And so wizards, one of the things that a lot of times when you have the sort of the trope of a wizarding world, of a secret world that's not connected to our world, those secret worlds are very often completely divorced from the real world, right? They're sort of insulated and made to not interact. And I feel that that's not quite true. You know, I feel like if you're a wizard, even if you have all the magic in the world, you still probably want an iPhone. Right? iPhones are great. You know, you still want modern technology. And you would probably like to have the best of both worlds, right? It's like, why shouldn't I have both modern medicine and magic medicine, if you can?
That is a very good point indeed. Ich gebe eine kurze Zusammenfassung, werde mich aber wirklich kurz fassen, damit wir noch einige Fragen beantworten können. Ich fragte Naomi nach Recherche, weil ihr die teilweise sehr wichtig ist. Ich habe ein Zitat von ihr gelesen, das hieß, dass sie mal eine Woche damit zugebracht hat, herauszufinden, ob es im Jahr 1806 in Edinburgh Bürgersteige gab. Und sie sagt, Recherche ist nicht wichtig nur dann, wenn sie es ist. So könnte man es, glaube ich, auf den Punkt bringen. Und sie hat Temeraire angeführt, ihr erstes Buch, das ja quasi eine alternative Geschichte der napoleonischen Kriege ist, aber mit Drachen. Und sie sagt, natürlich muss man jetzt die Leser dazu bringen, Drachen quasi überzeugend zu inszenieren, weil ich meine, es gab keine Drachen in den napoleonischen Kriegen, zumindest soweit ich weiß. Also hat sie versucht, alles andere drumherum so realistisch zu gestalten, dass eben auch die Drachen realistisch wegkommen dabei, weil sie einfach ein integraler Teil dieser Welt sind, dass man es gar nicht hinterfragt. Bei anderen Büchern, Uprooted zum Beispiel, auch ein frühes Buch, wo sie quasi die Geschichte ihrer Mutter verarbeitet hat. Dieses Buch spielt in einem alternativen Polen. Dieses Polen gibt es in der Form nicht. Es ist nur das Polen, wie sie es sich quasi vorgestellt hat als Fünfjährige. Also immer ein bisschen von Projekt zu Projekt abhängig. A couple of questions were coming in from the viewers. Will there be more books, the Scholomance universe?
So the main trilogy after Golden Enclaves, for me is complete. I've written a short story that's going to come in an anthology next year. That's set in the Scholomance and in the Scholomance universe. And then future stories, I have some thoughts about it. I am currently working on a totally different project, but I do have some plans for other things in the Scholomance. You know, I feel sometimes you write a universe, you write a story, and you feel like it's closed, right? I generally like to feel that what I love, there's the universes that I love the most are ones where you feel like you close the book, but the characters in the world are still going,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And the Scholomance universe in particular feels to me like a universe where there are lots of stories to be told, lots of things to happen, and that it's a universe that I wanted people to feel like they could imagine themselves into, in a way. Yeah, so I think there could easily be more. Yeah, we'll see.
Die Frage war, ob Scholomance weitergeführt wird, ob weitere Bücher geplant sind. Und Naomi sagt, also die grundsätzliche Trilogie, das, was sie damit erzählen wollte, ist eigentlich dann damit abgeschlossen. Es wird eine Kurzgeschichte erscheinen in einer Anthologie, die auch in der Scholomance-Welt spielt. Derzeit aber ist sie an einem völlig anderen Projekt dran, würde es aber nicht unbedingt ausschließen, eines Tages eben die Scholomance wieder zu eröffnen, sozusagen. Denn was sie eigentlich immer sehr gerne hat an diesen etwas längeren Reihen, diesen epischen Fantasy-Reihen, ist, dass, auch wenn man sie gelesen hat und zuklappt, das Gefühl hat, dass die Charaktere trotzdem weiterleben. Dass das Eigenleben nicht damit aufhört, nur weil man das Buch zu Ende gelesen hat, sondern dass die Welt weiterhin existiert und man aber eben auch dann jederzeit wieder Zutritt zu dieser Welt erlangen kann. Another question concerning the genre in which you would set Scholomance. I get some suggestions here. Would you say it's horror, dark academia, or urban fantasy? Any of those?
You know, I just write the things. To me, categorization is that's a marketing question. It's about how can you find books that are like this? How can you find books that are like the thing that I want, right? And it's not that I think that's not valuable, but I myself have a very hard time doing it. So I totally just defer to my publishers. Scholomance was published as YA in some countries and as adult in other countries.
Yeah.
Mostly, I think it's mostly about there are people whose job it is to think about which reader, the reader that comes into the bookstores in my country, what section are they going to go to where they would be happy if they found this book, right? Where can I find the most readers for this book? And I think that's a question. So, I feel like all of those aesthetics, I feel like probably not horror necessarily. Horror to me, I think of horror as typically a very intimate story. Like horror is sort of more about individual people sort of escaping a situation. And for me, one of the things that I love about the fantasy genre in general, speculative fiction in general, is that as a writer, it lets you control the set, it lets you control the stage, and it lets you create very large stakes. So, there's the sense in which my characters in the Scholomance, especially, in book 3, right? They have the capacity and the chance to literally change their own world, to transform their own world. And that is not alone, not as sole individuals, but through collective action. And that is a story that I like to tell. That's a story that's important to me. I feel like it's a story that allows us to imagine changing our own worlds, right? And so that's, I would say more broadly, that kind of slightly epic fantasy level. And then obviously Scholomance borrows from many different urban fantasy where it's our world, but there's a piece of it that's magical. That is Scholomance, right? Dark Academia, it is a school of magic, and it's not a nice school. It's not cozy and warm. So obviously, yes, it is. So I guess my answer is yes. that's my short answer. Yes.
Die Frage, ob das Genre ihrer Bücher, hat sie auch wie immer sehr elaboriert und schön beantwortet. In Kurzform sagt sie aber, sie schreibt das Zeug doch nur. Dafür ist sie nicht zuständig. Das ist eher eine Marketingentscheidung, wenn es darum geht, dass man das Buch möglichst gut im Buchladen platziert, wo es eben die Leute auch finden, denen es gefallen wird. Horror kann sie aber eher ausschließen. Horror hat für sie eher was Intimeres, was Persönlicheres, Konflikt mit einzelnen Personen eher. Deswegen würde sie durchaus das eher in so eine Epic oder Urban Fantasy Ecke stecken. Aber wie gesagt, das ist nichts, womit sie sich selbst eigentlich auseinandersetzt. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. It's focusing on Temeraire. We've been talking about this briefly already. It's a broad question. So where did the idea for Temeraire come from? Was there a specific character that inspired him as a dragon, or was it more about incorporating the dragons into the story?
Well, so Temeraire, I sort of talk about the lower levels of things that are going on in a story. With Temeraire, the upper level is really clear, which is it's literally, Pern. It's a family tree, and like Anne McCaffrey's Pern novels are on one side, and Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey Maturin books are on the other side. And then in the middle is my own personal fangirling of Napoleon, which I was 10 years old when I read my first biography of Napoleon, and it was one of those very hagiographic biographies, written for a 10-year-old. And I never quite I'm a fangirl. Obviously, as you get older, you're like, is this actually such a great thing? Maybe not. But fortunately, he's been dead a long time, so I can just enjoy the fandom, right? But sort of, and obviously that's why I make him the villain, because he's sort of, this huge figure. But so those three pieces are what kind of fused, along with Jane Austen is over here and Georgette Heyer is over here. Those things all melding in. And And it really was the immediate impetus was that I'd just seen the movie Master and Commander by Peter Weir with Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany. And I saw that movie, and then I literally read all 21 books of the Aubrey Maturin series, and saw the movie 3 times more in the span of 2 weeks. And I started writing fanfic, which is, something that I've been doing for 10 years as a hobby, and still do to this day. I love writing fanfic because it's a place of play. But as I was writing it, I suddenly, one day I was like, what if one of them was a dragon? And I started writing this, and I realized very quickly that I was not actually interested in the characters from the original universe. I was much more interested in, what does it mean to have dragons in the Napoleonic Wars? What is the world like? How are there dragons? How are the dragons getting used? And so I stopped writing fanfic, and I started creating the original world. And that's still very often to this day how I know that that I'm not writing fanfic anymore, that I'm like writing something original, is when I start becoming more interested in the world than I am in thinking about what's happening with the individual characters. And then I need new characters. I need new characters who function to illuminate the world, right? And work with the world and grow with the world. And yeah, so that's
Beautiful, beautiful. Gefragt nach den Inspirationen zu Temeraire, hat Naomi gesagt, dass das verschiedene Dinge waren. Einerseits Literatur, von der sie selbst beeinflusst wurde. Andererseits ihr Fangirl-Tum Napoleon betreffend. Das hört man, glaube ich, auch nicht alle Tage. Aber sie sagt, sie war 10 Jahre alt, hat aber in dem Alter auch schon die erste Biografie gelesen von Napoleon. Auch das hört man wirklich nicht alle Tage. Dennoch weiß sie natürlich, dass er eine schwierige Figur war und hat ihn ja dann auch, ich glaube, das ist kein Spoiler, zum Bösewicht ihrer ersten großen Saga gemacht. Master und Commander hat eine große Rolle noch gespielt. Dieser Film hat sie auch eiskalt erwischt. Den hat sie dann gleich zigmal gesehen, sich alle Bücher drumherum reingezogen. Und so entstand es dann. Sie kommt ja aus der Fanfiction, sie schreibt bis heute Fanfiction und hat irgendwann nur durch Zufall gemerkt, dass sie vielleicht doch mal diesen Schritt aus dieser Fanfiction rausmacht und eben eine eigene Welt entwirft. Und das ist immer ein gutes Zeichen für sie, wenn die tatsächliche Welt, in der eine Geschichte spielt, spannender ist als die Charaktere, die sie bewirkt haben. Okay, Naomi, this is it already. So time flies if you're having fun, I guess. Thank you so much for joining us today or tonight in our place, and I guess still today where you are right now. Have a good Halloween this year.
Yes.
Enjoy, and hopefully you can come over to Germany soon so you can do a proper book tour. Until then, thanks a lot again. That was really insightful. Vielen Dank auch an euch alle da draußen fürs Zuschauen. Wir haben leider nicht alle Fragen geschafft, aber wenn Naomi das nächste Mal in eurer Gegend ist, schaut bei ihr vorbei. Ihr seht, sie ist sehr freundlich und wird alles schon beantworten. Vielen Dank fürs Einschalten. Um 8:30 geht es hier noch weiter. Bleibt dran oder macht euch einen schönen Abend, so oder so. Lest bitte mehr. Ciao.